Well, good afternoon and thank you for joining all of the team of Industrial Commercial Partners for today's presentation, Land They're Not Making Any More. Now, we're really lucky today. We've got an expert in the industrial field in Robb, and he'll be taking us through a presentation about land supply and what's happening in that industrial market. But before we get into that, a little bit from each of the...
Based in Brisbane, FAL Property Group is a commercial real estate agency that offers sales, leasing and asset management services.
We specialise in the industrial and retail sectors.
And we're proud members of the Industrial Commercial Partners.
Property Services is an independently owned and operated business specialising in the sale, lease and management of industrial and commercial property. With offices in Western Sydney and South Sydney, Link operates in all core markets across metropolitan Sydney. To learn more, visit linkpropertyservices.com.au.
We are MLV Commercial and Industrial Real Estate, based here in Perth.
As our name suggests, we specialise in industrial property sales, leasing and asset management.
We are founding members of Industrial Commercial Partners and have enjoyed working with ICP over the past 8 years.
We hope you enjoy today's presentation.
Okay, I've just been told that you might have missed a little bit of that, so I'll go from the top. And we are just so excited to have Robb present to us today. He's an expert in industrial real estate with over 25 years' experience as a valuer, an advisor, an acquisitions manager. He's got a Bachelor of Business, a graduate diploma in Applied Finance and Investment, and he's also a director of Urbis. He's highly regarded and he's a respected consultant by major local and foreign institutional investors. So before we get to Shane, in preparing for today, I came across a terrific quote that I really feel sums up our current market. There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. That's the rapid part of the growth that we're dealing with. Now, Lenin, the author and Russian revolutionary, was the guy that came up with that. We may not agree with his politics, but I think he sums up how we all feel about the industrial market at the moment. Now, thanks to COVID, our lives have changed and logistics have certainly had to change to meet our demands. I've read a number of articles talking about the massive growth of industrial property being directly related to e-commerce, and how we've all become great adopters of it, and Shane will touch on that in a minute. But recently we've started to feel the interruptions of supply, and we're not very patient as a group of people. So I also think one of the great drivers that we're having out there at the moment is that last mile effect. We want things now, so they need to be in the warehouses for us to grab. So in 2018, Shane and his team at Urbis were engaged by the Property Council of Australia to critically review and analyse the government in Victoria's urban development program. Now, this was focusing on the remaining industrial land supply, and I attended the event that you spoke at. At the time, the report prepared by Shane and his team concluded that the supply of land was a lot closer to 5.3 years. Now, the government at the time felt that it was about 23 years. So I think that's a very interesting stat, and we're seeing how it all plays out at the moment. So as it's lunchtime for most of us on the eastern seaboard, or morning tea for those over in the west, sit back, have a bite, and let's see what is in store for industrial property and land supply in Australia. Over to you, Shane.
Thanks, Mark. And thank you for the ICP group to get me to present today. And looking at that photo, I think you talked about 25 years, did you? I look a little bit older than that now, that's for sure. So what I might do is I'll just jump straight to contents. There's quite a bit for me to run through, but obviously what we're trying to do is talk to the main concept, which is, well, where does, land, and they aren't making it anymore. So hopefully by the end of it, you'll have a sense for what might be in front of us. But what I like to do is normally start with, well, what are we talking about as an industrial market size? So as a good valuer, I always have lots of stats behind me. So what you can see there is really the main buildings in each of the major sectors that we're going to talk to today, or the main markets. So if I start at the top, the Melbourne market, almost 18 million square metres of space. And as I work down the eastern seaboard, you can see those numbers. So Melbourne is by far the biggest footprint as an industrial marketplace, totalling up the eastern seaboard at about 38 million square metres, growing pretty rapidly, as we'll see a little bit later on. But what I might do is I'll run right across to the right side of the chart, because I keep hearing in the market and through a lot of other consultants these numbers around, well, if you get new population of 100,000, you need X number of square metres of space. So I thought I'd try and pull that apart. So what I've done is I've pulled in 2021 census data, and these are the metro census data, not the state. And then what I've done is I've looked at it and said, well, if I've got, let's start with Melbourne, if I've got 17.9 million square metres of what I call the larger format space, how much of that larger format space do I need per person? And you can see running down the right side, that ranges from about 2.5 to 3.5, but as an average point sits at about 3. So for a population of 12.3 million, we need an average of 3 metres of warehouse to service them, and that's why we've got 37.6 square metres in total. What I'm now going to do is look at some of the supply that's been going on, and I might start on the right side. What this looks to show you is in those major 4 markets, what is the average supply of new warehouses on a year-on-year basis? So you can see obviously Sydney and Melbourne being the main 2 markets, and Brisbane in round terms being about double that of Perth. If I pulled out the last 2 years of the Melbourne market, and if you now drift to the left, you'll see 2 green columns sitting there at the end, that would have fallen back to 350,000 metres per annum. So in the last 10 years, Sydney's actually been growing at a quicker rate, but Melbourne's really only taken over in the last 2 years. And if I jump forward 1 slide, what that does, nothing's changed on the right. If you're looking that way, go to your left. And what it's showing on the left is where we think construction will get to by the end of 2022. So we're sitting here in early September, so obviously our team's making calls on when some buildings might get finished and some buildings might roll into next year. So it's not an exactly precise science, but that's where we think it's going to sit. So what you can see is there is a little bit of a step away in terms of where we've been the last couple of years, certainly at least in the main 2 markets of Sydney and Melbourne. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk through each of those major cities and just give you a bit more of a sense as to, well, what's the activity been in the last 5 years? Where's it been occurring within the main metro area? And what the right image does is shows you by, let's call them dots, the dots as to where all the buildings have been built, and the different colours represent the different size of those buildings. So you can see pretty strong concentration in Sydney out into that outer Western Sydney belt. And then if I jump across to the right, you can see that the Sydney construction over the last 10 years has been pretty consistent, really. It's been sitting pretty well, probably only about 10 or 15% from that long-term average. The number that you can see there at the moment for Sydney forecast for this year is a real drop away, and that comes back a little bit to the topic of today, which is about land supply and availability. And in the longer term, what we're seeing is about 250 hectares being absorbed, or I like to use the term chewed up each year. Now, treat that as a longer term average and treat that as an indicative number. It's certainly not precise. If I move up to Brisbane, you can see, again, I'll start on the right, in terms of where that distribution of construction's occurred, and it has mostly been down that southern corridor. There is still some land supply up to the north, but clearly all the occupiers and the users have demonstrated that from that position, I can commute down to Sydney and Melbourne, and then I can also service the growing Gold Coast region. So that's really become very popular. And you can see from a construction point of view, pretty strong in that period from, say, 13 to 17. And that was really what that led to, and some of that development was speculative development. What that led to is vacancy in that market, probably getting about as high as it's been, and we come to vacancy numbers later, but it was sort of sitting at 4 or 5%. So we had a bit of a pause, but we've started to regrow in that marketplace since then. And if we try and again estimate that longer term average land take up, we're going to say it's about 125 hectares. So jumping down now to that bigger market in Melbourne, and you can see probably a more distributed, from a construction point of view, it's more distributed throughout the metropolitan area by the sort of the three main markets of west, north and southeast. Obviously, there's a big cluster of activity happening in the west, but it is reasonably well distributed relative to the others. And you can see it's come up off a reasonably low base from 2012 and really hit its straps certainly in the last 2 and 3 years. So those averages of the last 3 years is probably going to be sort of 750,000, which is well ahead of that longer term average.
The 2018, 2019 building rates. It's an interesting part of the graph.
Yeah, look, in my mind, it's more of a blip of supply. And it might not necessarily be a zoned supply. It was probably more the developers who've got the capacity to deliver the buildings having control of the land. Not even waiting, just having control of the land.
Okay.
So obviously running down their pipeline somewhere and then looking to regrow it. Obviously a window of time before they've been able to get control of the land, get it activated, get it in the market. That's really the reason for that gap, I would argue.
And also that growth.
And then it's kicked, correct. And if we look at that Melbourne long-term average, we're sort of saying again, long-term, 300 hectares in round numbers. And then if we roll across to Perth, again, there's pretty strong concentration of where activities occurred. It's really been around that Roe Highway or down at Jandakot Airport. That's where most of the developments occurred in recent time. And you can see, looking over across to the right, I guess, that first 5 years, a much stronger Perth market. Obviously, then the next year's pretty softer economically. A little bit constrained by land supply too, but probably more economic influence rather than anything else. We're in the Perth market at the moment, and we've just talked through where the buildings are distributed, mostly in the sort of south and southeast, and that construction activity has been quite strong in the 2012 to 2016 period, but I'd describe it as more modest in 17 through to current day. As an average land take-up, we're probably sitting at about 70 hectares, but I am expecting that will continue to, we'll see some upside there as their economy is also improving. I've jumped on to everyone's favourite topic at the moment, which is multi-level warehousing, and the big question mark is it financially viable? So if you're not seeing the slides, on the left side of my slide currently is the photo.
Just on that, reading some of the messages, hit the green refresh and you should be fine. Back to you.
Thank you. So on the left of my screen is a toll building in Singapore. It was only built in the last probably 3 or 4 years. It's 7 stories high. That sits at 82 metres. It's about 20 stories of an office building.
Wow.
It's got 100,000 metres of footprint over those 7 floors. And if you see the front end of the image, and this might be hard to describe if you can't, but it's pretty well a ramp up. So the product isn't delivered by lift. It's delivered by trucks which move between the floors and unload into each floor. If I go to the right side of my screen, I've now got a photo of a project that's just started marketing in Matraville in New South Wales, and it's proposed to be developed by Hale. It's 2 levels, sitting at 23 metres, and that's 1 floor at 8.5 and 1 at about 13.5. So total of 20,000 metres in total. We'll talk a little bit later about construction costs, but I always like this stat as one way, in my mind at least, to reason how viable is it in our marketplace. It really comes back to rents and the market's ability to accept where rents need to be to make it financially viable. And construction costs, obviously growing at the moment. But if I take the Singapore example to the left, the average construction cost in the Asian market is about $11 a metre. The average construction cost per hour in the Australian market is just under $70 a metre. It's poles apart. And that's Turner Townsend data too, just to give them their valuable plug. So vacancy. We started tracking industrial vacancy in 2013 in Melbourne, and we've built up the eastern seaboard since then and have probably been reporting on that, I'd say about 5 years if I had to guess. We do it on a sort of a 3-monthly interval. You can see in the first couple of years that show up on that chart that our vacancy sat anywhere between 2.4 and 5.8%, with Brisbane, it's always historically been the highest vacancy. But in the last couple of years, that's really worked its way down. I've heard some of the major agencies quote that Globally, the industrial vacancy sits on par, is the lowest vacancy globally. So, and I guess as you'll see throughout this presentation, there's no reason why I'm thinking that that's going to change anytime soon. So obviously a big part of it, and Mark talked about at the start in terms of e-commerce. So for those that can see the slides, I'm going to start top right. What I'm going to talk to is the rate of e-commerce penetration in the Australian market first. So in 2010, you can see that was sitting at about 3%. And some of the more recent data tells us that it's sitting at about 12.7%. Interestingly, it's dropped off ever so slightly now that we're all, well, at least Melbourneites, are free to go out and go to shopping centres and do what we like. But in any event, it's... Shopping centres? Well, maybe not 2 miles like us, but it's grown rapidly. But as you can see, when you step down a fraction, if we benchmark that against like-for-like data in, say, the US or the UK, you can see 17, 25%. We're well off those numbers. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that we're going to get to those numbers because they are different economies, they're different geographic spreads. There's a whole lot of reasons why you can't say, well, we'll definitely end up at those levels. But I think you can see from the trajectory we've seen so far, there's no reason to think that that might not continue to go. So what I'm going to do is I might go with what I call pure play online commerce. And I'm going to ask you, Mark.
Yes.
HB Commerce, have you heard of them?
Well, the honest answer is no.
No, okay. So when I do these presentations to a group of people, I always ask, or to clients, I always ask that question. And most of the time, everyone looks at me with a stunned look. I will admit when I was in GPT's office last week, of course they knew because they own the asset, which is the last one at 70,000 metres.
I wish I knew.
Yes. So I just find this fascinating from the point of view that more broadly in the marketplace that it's not super well known, but if you look at their rate of growth, I guess it talks to some degree to some of those big green columns we saw about the construction that's occurred in Melbourne. So in 2018, they moved into 15,500 metres, and probably only a couple of months ago, they moved into 70,000 metres. So that's pretty strong growth. Definitely. In the market, I'll now drop across to the right and I'll start at the bottom. If we look at some of our broad data when we capture some of this construction activity, we can say in really round numbers it's 65% pre-committed. That varies by year. It varies for a whole range of reasons. What a lot of the major developers have started doing is, or have been doing for a number of years actually, is win a pre-commitment, build a spec next to it. What we're seeing in the current market is we're seeing, because vacancy is so low, we are starting to see that gravity towards speculative a lot more, and particularly where private developers are looking to do fund-throughs. So, and we talked before about Cadence. So Cadence have done a couple of those out in the southeast.
And
grab the site.
Success.
Absolutely. Grab the site, design the building, find a capital partner, deliver the building. Ultimately, when we're building, what are those two buildings, 40 or 60,000 metres? When we're building that sort of footprint, it takes us sort of 12 to 18 months. So there's plenty of time in there to start pre-filling tenants before we even get to PC.
Mm-hmm.
Earlier on, I talked about a number of, if everyone remembers, 3 metres as the average warehouse area per population. What I've chosen to do here is look at, this is incremental population rather than total population. Just to compare, when we look at the average e-commerce, and we compare that to a population growth, what does that mean from a floor area per person? So if we grab the first 5 years, so 2010 to 15, you can see the average e-commerce was only 4.5. Jump across to the end, that's 4.28 metres. I'll roll down. So we go to 16 to 20, that's 5.5 metres. If you believe or subscribe to, call it 15% as an average over the period from 21 to 25, that's saying we need about 6.5 metres per person of new population. You can see the population numbers are pretty consistent. Now, perhaps where that population of 1.12 sits will be a little bit dictated by what happens on a migration point of view, but not being an economist, I'll go to the next slide. So rents. So Mark and his peers have all been telling the buyers, you've got to get in now because rents are growing. So I thought I'd best test the theory.
It looks like we're right.
You are right. hard as that is for me to say. So what I've done is I've really just picked some of the main, a single location in each of the main markets. And I'm going to start with Melbourne because that's where I come from. So if we go to Truganina, a large format building that in 2019 was leased for $75 a metre with a 35% incentive has actually just been leased at about $95 a metre and a 12.5% incentive. So if I run across to that last two columns, the blues to draw your attention, 8.2% on a face rent and almost 20% on an effective basis. You can see I've done the same thing in the other markets. So Eastern Creek and Richlands, two sort of strong industrial areas in New South Wales and Queensland, pretty consistent really in terms of an outcome on both the face rent and obviously the effective. Surprised me a little bit in terms of the rate of growth out at Jandakot, given the economies have been a bit slower. But at the same time, you saw from that earlier slide around how much has been delivered that it's a really tight market. It's probably been sitting below 1% vacancy for probably a year and a half, 2 years. So as a result of that, it's seen the strongest face rental growth, and incentives haven't quite tapered off there. They were never that high anyway, but they haven't quite tapered off as much. So on an effective basis, not quite the same. The big question that myself as a valuer consultant gets asked all the time, what I'll do is I'll start top right, is, interest rates are going up. What are cap rates doing, Shane? So the top right chart is my attempt to answer that question, or at least show where we currently think the prime yields have gone to. So just to quickly explain that chart, there's a green line, and that's the prime cap rates up the eastern seaboard. There's a blue line, and that's the 10-year index bond rate. Now, I'll pause for a moment and pretend to be an economist. So there's two 10-year bond rates. There's the bond rate that we all see in the paper every day, which is sitting at about 3.2% currently. And there's the index bond rate, which currently sits at about 1.45%. The 10-year bond rate's been growing like that. The index bond rate started like that, and it's actually dropped 25 basis points in the last 2 months. So, and the theory behind using the index bond rate is because a smarter economist told me I should be, and it's really around an index bond rate seeks to shield an investor from inflation. And property is really meant to be an investment that seeks to shield an investor from inflation. It's a hedge. So that's the logic between tracking those two from a spread point of view. Now, obviously what it does show is that the spread's in at its tightest point for a long time, but at the same time, the gravity to the sector's at its strongest point as well. So it's not unreasonable to see that. And if I actually went back in time and showed that same chart for the lead up to GFC, that actually became a negative. So,
so 2008.
Sort of, yeah, correct. Now I'll drop to the bottom of the right side of the screen. So there is a lack of transactional evidence for me to be right at the moment. There's plenty of deals being sprouted, but I think there hasn't been a lot of deals between probably April, May through to now. So it's at a 4-ish month period. There's one, what I call bellwether in the market right now. So that's the circa 800 mil Dexus portfolio of about 10 properties. It's yet to be concluded, so I can't tell you what the answer is. But I guess talking to some groups that might be looking at that, my sense is that it's sitting around that 50 basis points as to where we might get to. Obviously, yesterday or the day before, we had another 50 basis points added to our cash rate at least. Whether that forces that out to 75, got to tell you, time will tell.
So do you see that potentially sub 4 because they're so hard?
No, it'll be in the 4s.
I
think that'll be in the 4s. I think it'll be in the early 4s, but I think it'll be in the 4s. I do think that in the short term, we're probably not going to see 3s for a little while, unless there's a significant development opportunity to it, or as we've seen from rental growth, it's a rent that might have been set a little while ago and locked in at 2.5%, and therefore it's a mile away from where it should be. So they're the two areas that you're going to see 3s. For most other deals, it's going to sit in that 4 to 5 band, subject to the usual parameters. Right. Yeah. So I'll run up to the top of the left now, and I like to draw the comparison from a capital point of view between where it wants to go. In the real estate, it wants to go in three major sectors, although a lot of the alternative asset classes are getting traction, data centres, self-storage. We won't talk about them though. We'll focus on retail and office for now. There's obviously some negative sentiment towards both those sectors. I'm not smart enough to have the answer as to when they'll normalise, but because there's that negative sentiment and because most investors are underweighted in industrial and logistics, there's still strong capital. The strong capital, I would argue, is pausing at the moment just to see that interest period sort of normalise. But I think it's there ready to be executed as soon as that normalisation occurs. When I think about those other asset classes, I like to compare it to if I want to get out of a $300 million asset, and let's say the average industrial size varies, but let's call it 30 mil, I've got to buy 10 of them. It's pretty tough. It's hard to get that critical mass and really get full exposure into a sector. But certainly now our industrial yields have sort of got to the point where they're in line with the global environment. And the reality is, but whilst we might see a lot of our local players' brands buying assets, the reality is sitting behind them is a lot of foreign capital. So we are playing in a global market. There's no doubt. Even though we see most of our local brands and think it must be local activity versus when a foreign buys directly, a lot of the time foreigners are invested in wholesale funds, and therefore you're seeing a brand rather than
it's a pool of money.
Everyone behind it. Correct.
And is that it's probably best described as a maturing of the Australian industrial market?
Yeah, I think so. I think everyone
catching up.
Yeah, everyone looks at the Australian economy over the long term now, and if you go back 20 years, it's some might question how we've gone through COVID, but in a broader sense, the global economy looks at Australia and says, pretty safe spot to have my money.
Done well.
And again, normally the investment in our geography is a very small part of a bigger pie. Mm-hmm. So it's a pretty safe spot to put a slice. Yep. In terms of what I've tried to do on the bottom left is really try and look at 2021 before we started to see interest rates turn, and look forward to 22 and have my crack at ranking where the buyer activity is expected to be in 22. So you can see REITs, wholesale funds clearly leading the market in 21, but we're expecting the super funds to be pretty active in 22, and the big difference there is debt. They're much less reliant, and in fact quite often don't even use it. And even some of the foreign investors get access to cheaper debt if they choose to deploy in their own right. Privates have probably been missing out behind all the groups above for a long time. Maybe changing. I'm starting to hear of a few deals where obviously in a what's becoming a slightly uncertain market, certainty is important. So one of the deals I was told about yesterday is where I understand some of the groups, the three groups above, the privates were slightly higher on price, but in a true private fashion, there's your deposit, I'll settle 30 days, no DD, they were the ultimate buyer. So there's going to be that window in the short term for some of our high net worth privates to get assets, and probably some good assets that they might still not be comfortable at where the yields sit, but are still much better than where they might have been if they were in the market in 21 and didn't manage to deploy whatever money they wanted to get into the market.
Well, if they've seen this today, they can be a little bit more confident about washing away the DD.
They can. That's coming from the agent rather than the more conservative valuer to the other side of the screen. Now, before I went through what rents have done, so I figure it's only fair that I talk to land values, and ultimately that's our big topic for today. So similar sort of concept, pick out some of the major markets in each of the 4 states that we're talking about, circle on about a 2 hectare serviced lot, and then see what's happened to that land value for that individual lot in 2018. Jump forward 4 years or thereabouts, and what's that worth today? Now, pardon me, as you can see, if I look at New South Wales, Brisbane and Perth, really good consistency, sort of 12 to 15%, strong. We all wish we'd bought in 2018 if we had that stat 4 years ago. But you can see some really strong growth in Melbourne, sitting up at 35% annually and 240. And there's a number of examples that I won't talk to where I see significantly extreme diversions of price in a really short period of time. So the market is still finding its feet. I always was amused by Sydney clients who had come down, and they were right, 10 years ago, but jump forward to today and it's a different market. So you fly into Melbourne and it's completely flat, and the land seems to go forever. But as I'll get to later on, that isn't quite the case. Well, sorry, the land does go forever, but you can't build on it forever.
But it's just that's the market at the moment. It's just this weak in the decades of growth.
Super strong demand and reducing supply. That's a simple market dynamic, really, isn't it? That's what's driving that at the moment. So to move on to the topic of, where might those future land opportunities be on a state-by-state basis? So the chart to your right is the one you saw a little bit earlier, showing you where all the constructions occurred in the last 5 years. I'm hoping this is clear enough for everyone on screen. There's sort of two etched red areas off to the left, pretty close to the cluster of major activity out in that Western Corridor. The first one is a precinct called Mamre's Road Precinct. It's got about 850 hectares. As you can see to the left side of the screen, it's got most of the major active developers all have land holdings in that part of the world. And all those developers were super excited when their land got rezoned in a period of probably about 12 to 15 months when they thought it might take 2+ years. So everyone was running around high-fiving at that point. The big challenge for it is infrastructure. So it needs significant roads, water, sewer, and they're not going to be delivered in the time frame that those top developers would like it to be. And there's quite a bit of uncertainty in there at the moment as to when will they get developed. Now, if you recall earlier on in one of the charts, we saw Sydney drop off in terms of where its construction was. And that's a big reason for that.
Lack of opportunity.
So in that Mamre Road precinct, there would be well over 100,000 metres of tenants ready to go, negotiated terms with developers. If they could build on the building, start the building tomorrow, they would be. So that's sort of changed that dynamic in Sydney a little bit. At some point, you can see by virtue of adding 850 hectares to the other part that I've got there of 2,500 hectares, we are going to end up with a bit over 3,000 hectares of employment land in the future. So it's sort of a bit of a short-term pain, hopefully for long-term normalisation.
And at the 250 hectares per annum, that 850 will get consumed fairly quickly.
Yeah, so at the 250, much like we saw in the Melbourne market, will go to an accelerated rate.
To catch up.
350. So whilst Mamre Road is great, it looks like a big number, doesn't it? 850 hectares. When you throw 300 or 350 into it, it disappears pretty quickly. It's a 2 to 3 year horizon. So obviously the infrastructure coming into Aerotropolis, whilst not quite as important, becomes pretty important in the scheme of things for that to get in there in time. So drop down to Melbourne. And I was talking Melbourne before and I was being harsh on my Sydney clients and peers. The line that you can see that sort of runs around Melbourne is what we call the urban growth boundary. It's been in place in Melbourne for a long time, and I won't claim to know the exact dates because I'm not a planner. I do work with a few of them though. But in 2010, that was first moved to a reasonably significant extent to bring in a new wave of supply. And in 2012, there was what was called a logical inclusions, was just for the bits that they missed to bring them into play. And currently, the way that line works is that it requires both Houses of Parliament to agree to moving it. Now, both sides of politics very rarely agree, so I'm not going to put any time frame around when that might occur. What I've then done is I've circled two areas. I've circled one to the north, and I can see that that's missing an area. In total, that's about 4,000 hectares. Now, that's not just in Beveridge, that's in a range of PSP and other areas in that northern region, or what I'd call the upper northern region. Some of those estates are ready to get activated right now, and there's been a few released to the market. Some of those are what we call a PSP, Precinct Structure Plan. which is controlled by the Victorian Planning Authority, which is actually yet to be activated or even started. So what that means is at some point they'll make a decision that becomes viable to be activated. They go through a process of environmental and services and a whole lot of investigation, and then 5 years later you can build a building on it.
Yep.
In round terms. If I now drop down to the west, you can see a similar circled area, and apologies that does run past the urban boundary. Rest assured, Derrimut Fields and Chartwell East are both within the urban growth boundary.
And there would have been a few people excited.
There would have been some excited there, but you can take away that disappointment. So that's about 1,000 hectares just over. So in part of the land to the north is what's called the BIFT, Beverage Intermodal Freight Terminal, and in part of that land to the west is what's called the WIFT, Western Intermodal Freight Terminal. Both have been sitting in planning policy for well over 10 years. Mm-hmm. If you went and read a document 5 years ago, you'd think, if I jump forward to 22, it'll be there by now. Any of the developers who have bought land in any of those regions will know that isn't the case, disappointingly. So they're both precincts of reasonably significant land that should be available to the market right now and needs to be available to the market right now to try and control rents and land value growth to make a viable economy. But they're not, and I don't know whether, don't ask me when.
What about down towards Geelong there, the circle you have?
Yeah, so that's got different planning controls. So that sort of sits within the Geelong planning control. So therefore, the rezoning of the land that NAB and others have will be dictated by that region rather than necessarily being part of the urban growth boundary.
So it might leapfrog?
It could, yeah. I won't claim to know the exact status of where that's at the moment, but absolutely, it could. It will certainly leapfrog some of it, because again, some of the land in that 4,000 hectares up around Beveridge and beyond probably won't be coming to market while you and I are working. So it might leapfrog some of that. So they're the stumbling block. Of course, I don't have infrastructure up there, but I don't know how many stories I've heard from local-based developers in Melbourne that have said, I finished my brand new building, I got my tenant in there, and then I had to get diesel generators out the front because I was waiting for power to get connected. Or there's always an infrastructure hurdle. So the infrastructure, I think nationally you could safely say, and hopefully there's no infrastructure groups on the call, Mark, or I will be in trouble, literally lags every time. The forward planning is just not that great. Mm-hmm. Up to Brisbane, and we're very much getting, we talked about in our working lives, hopefully in our kids' working lives that'll get there, but Ebenezer and Brommelton are two big precincts. There's obviously others, but these are the big ones that I can't quite see the numbers, but I'm going to say 6,000 and about 1,800 are the numbers from memory. So big precincts of land. Of those two, I would have thought Ebenezer's got more legs because there is an industrial precinct in Ipswich. You can see the urban area by virtue of the grey on the slide, and that's the main roadway out to feed to the other states. And we'll run across to Perth, and much like WIFT and BIFT, latitude 32 I've been reading about for 10 plus years, and again it's rolling back to infrastructure. In this case, it is roads and water and sewage, but it's also the proposed relocation of part of the port operation out of Fremantle down to Outer Harbour. Okay, and that connection between Outer Harbour into latitude 32.
Yeah, because it looks like it would be on a fairly good motorway there.
Yes.
But yeah, how far south are we talking from Fremantle?
Now you're going to test my memory on Perth. I'm sure your Perth colleagues will know that answer straight away. I'm going to say...
You can text me if you want.
I'm going to say 30 or 40 Ks.
Good enough for me.
And see how wrong I am through the chat. So in terms of, obviously the bigger question we're trying to answer today is, so what's the solution for land supply?
Have you got one?
And I'm disappointing you, of course. I don't think there's any silver bullet. If I had to pick a silver bullet, it's probably the next one is that industry seeking to get government and the major infrastructure groups more aligned. Mm-hmm. So at the moment, we've got industry, and that is developers and occupiers, strong demand, strong appetite, strong capital support. Mm-hmm. Everyone's ready to go, but the infrastructure just isn't keeping up with it. we have development contributions, we have gates, we have all these sort of things. So we have every local government, every council, every state has mechanisms to, in theory, facilitate it, but it still isn't happening. And I won't claim to have the answer to that. In the next section, what I thought was worth talking to is at least the one positive out of most of this is that there is at least a recognition now within broader governments that what we call industrial land, industrial logistics, employment land is important. I won't go through each of them, but those first three, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, are all policies which are established to protect land for the purposes that we want to see and our clients want to see on them.
So 2020 in Melbourne has been around a while. So have they revisited that recently?
What they call the MICLUP, as the planners call it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's really just identifying the precincts, and it's what it's trying to do is prioritise some of those precincts.
And I can see on there that obviously Brisbane and Perth have Sydney revisited recently?
I don't have the date on the Sydney one, but it is within the last 5 years. I apologise I don't have that date, but it is a recent document. So all of them have been recent documents, as you can see. The Perth one is a little bit different because state government's sort of more heavily involved in the industry there, but they've got not quite the same protectionary policy. It's more about a bit of a growth strategy for them. Hopefully we're going okay for time, Mark.
Doing well.
Doing okay. Good work. So this is the last slide. Everyone will be pleased to know you're not going to get hit with 10 more. So what I might do is I might call out a couple of things rather than go through every point because we're going to provide these later on. We've talked to rents and what they're doing. I've talked to cap rates slightly softening. I might talk about construction costs because I haven't talked a lot about that, albeit a little bit. My humble view, and again, I'm no economist, my humble view is we're seeing a combination of things. We're seeing materials, we're seeing labour, and we're seeing, hey, I'm really busy. So they're the three elements that are pushing up construction costs. As you can see, the build numbers start dropping away. If I then also compare to the other major sectors of commercial and retail, some subbies overlap, major builders don't, I know. But if the new supply in those drops away, and you can see that clearly already, then there's going to have to be some normalisation in construction costs. I'll say, 15, 12 months, something like that. I'll be wrong, but hopefully I'm somewhere near right. Automation, big part of the market, certainly has driven a lot of some of that new development. So if you think of the major players, Coles, Woolies, Aldi's got an objective towards going towards automation, even Kathmandu, everyone's playing in that space to varying degrees.
Dark warehouses.
I still think I use the term up, as you can see there, it's not for the masses quite yet. It's for the majors. Some in that area tell me that the cost of the equipment's starting to come down, and that might help facilitate its wider use in the marketplace. But if you look at some of the buildings that some of those groups have done, and let's use Melbourne because we're in Melbourne, and we'll talk about Woolies out at Dandenong South, your stomping ground. So they moved out of 65,000 in Broadmeadows to 56,000 in Dandenong, cut their labour force in half, and went dark warehousing 45 metres tall. 20-year lease, significant investment in the equipment. So, the mid-sized corporates and transport companies can't invest that sort of capital. Toll TNT out at Melbourne Airport, same thing. Significant investment in equipment. If you're doing 3-year contracts, I can't afford to invest in that infrastructure. So until it becomes a better price point, it won't work.
Gotcha.
I'll jump to land tax. Land tax is a smoky in terms of what it's going to do for occupancy cost. When we were chatting before we started today about the new legislation that's proposed for Brisbane around trying to bring together all your national holdings and hit you in Brisbane. I'm not sure how that works. I'm sure plenty of constitution lawyers are out running around now reading the documents saying you can't do that. Obviously in Victoria and other states we have multiple holding, which is hitting you for multiple ownership in the one state, but to have a state tax that runs beyond borders seems a bit rich.
I think the accountants will be busy just adjusting some names.
Yes, maybe. Yes, yeah. Subtrust 1 through 300. So in the longer term, as I've sort of said, there's no real solution for the for the land supply, because you can see every example I've shown in most instances pushes further out. Obviously, in most of the markets, we do have brownfield opportunities, so we're probably going to push back in a little bit. Rail, I'll quickly talk on this. Very limited in Melbourne. More banks, significant investment. We're going to see rail continue to grow in that market. Obviously, Infrastructure Australia is looking to enhance that and invest in that sort of Brisbane-Melbourne connection to try and take TEUs and road trucks off the road and move to rail, double-sided stackers. So it's going to happen. It'll happen in the future. My counter to that is, well, what if automated vehicles run past it? Don't know. We're looking in the future, so we don't have to be right. I think that's probably. I'm conscious a little bit of time, so
yeah,
I will
we'll get to
pause
some of
there
these
if
questions.
that's okay. Unless there's anything directly you want to do.
Just on the rail, so all the work that's obviously occurred here in Victoria, whilst beneficial for helping us get around, it hasn't had a mind so much for movement of the containers, has it?
No. So most of the rail investment we've done has been separation for passenger. The next wave of investment is obviously there's a planned further rail into the port. There's obviously the connection down at Salter at Portlink and up into Somerton.
Yes.
So they're future infrastructure projects that should enhance rail.
And you imagine there'd be one to the west as well, but at the moment Sydney's got that competitive advantage.
Absolutely, yeah. In terms of, but it has to, because the traffic, in terms of, if you consider the timeframes from getting from Port of Melbourne to Truganina, and then compare that from getting from Botany to Eastern Creek, very different environment.
Yep. No, there's a few people in dear old New South Wales. Righto. So we've just got a couple of questions here, and thank you for everyone that's jumped on and asked those questions, and we'll just run through those. So in Victoria, well, this is always a bit of a popular one, the potential rezoning of green wedge land. What's your view, Shane, about whether this supply issue that we have in Victoria bearing a bit more pressure on government to review their green wedge strategy? Do you see that changing?
Yeah, look, I think there's been many groups who have been agitating with government around some pretty logical land that we all look at and say, well, it's not generating anything for the economy at the moment. It's not generating any, I think of green wedge as a park or something like that. Well, it's certainly not doing that. So it's sitting there adjacent, immediate buildings doing nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Logically, anyone with a logical brain says
include logical inclusion.
Yeah, there you go, logical inclusion. But state government's been pretty clear, at least the current state government's been pretty clear that they're not open to entertaining the prospect of changing green wedge zone land. They see it as that's back to that protectionism policy. It's sort of a part of all that.
Okay, well, maybe that's not what the answer that they wanted, but that's okay. So New South Wales, we've got a question there. With Sydney's industrial land supply continuing to be constrained and expensive, the need to head vertical, you've more or less answered this. And I suppose the question is, do you see that happening to a wider scale, maybe to Sydney's west? Yeah,
as I've talked to before, it's all about construction cost. And you look at our labour costs, that's why I reason that. I must admit, I'm sure there'll be some builders on the call that will know what portion of labour is as a portion of building a whole warehouse.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to assume it's up there as a reasonable chunk of it. So I'm starting to see some groups talk about, I've got a sloped site, so maybe I'll try and bring in 2 levels that way. But I think we're going to be capped out at the 2-level example that we saw up there.
Matraville.
I think what we're seeing, so it's funny, Goodman have developed for Amazon a building out in the west.
Mm-hmm.
It's 200,000 metres of floor area, but it's over 4 levels. So it's a 50,000 metre footprint. It doesn't have full concrete floors like you and I would think of the toll example I showed.
You're not driving your truck up.
And there's no vehicle movements above ground. It's all conveyors and automation. So I think we're going to see that. But again, much like the example of Coles and Woolies, the automation, it's for few rather than for many.
So it's good that they've got some automation. When I went out to the Dandenong warehouse,
yes,
they were all behind trolleys. It was a bit of an eye-opener. Righto, to Queensland, just conscious of time. Again, the abnormally high building costs must be happening everywhere.
It is.
Are causing some property owners to land bank until it is more feasible to build. I suppose that's a statement rather than a question. Do you think that this factor is affecting land supply in Brisbane?
Yeah, well, in terms of land being developed is perhaps the element. So I guess put it this way, if I look at some of the data I've put up and I think about what rents are doing and where construction costs are currently at, and if you believe me, if you're foolish enough to believe me that construction costs will drop away, and I bought my land at a reasonably good rate, so therefore it's not costing me too much to hold it, then I would have thought a prudent approach might be I might hold back, because I'm not seeing this big wave of new supply coming, and any of the new supply that's coming is
some time off
and some far away. So I don't think it's unreasonable for me to sit back and go, well, maybe I'll wait for the best deal. So I won't run out and do the first deal that presents itself to me. Maybe I'll wait for the best deal. Maybe I'll wait for the best covenant to come along before I run out and do it. So that's going to impact to some degree new supply coming into the market.
Yeah, and probably smart business in a lot of ways. Over in the West, we have a question, and this relates back to, I suppose, how the government does control release of land. So it says, in recent years, subdivisions of a large nature have been brought on by Development WA or Land Corp. So there's been very little industrial land other than small subdivisions by privates and maybe some REITs. But is there a role for a private developer to get into those larger subdivisions and try to change supply?
Yeah, so you can see the supply's been low, and I'm suggesting that I think it'll turn in the next few years. Well, if there's land availability, of course, I think the demand will be there. Obviously, for those that don't work in the Perth market, it's pretty unique in that most of the land supply is delivered by Development WA and their earlier versions of Entity.
Yep.
So, but what they mostly do is deliver the smaller format sites. So I think there is an opportunity at the moment. The main development, if you remember back to that earlier chart, was sort of the Roe Highway Estate and Jandakot Airport. That's where all the activity's really been going.
Yep.
So Roe Highway is pretty well done. There's obviously some areas of land around there, but in terms of major parcels, Jandakot's still got a bit to go. But I think there is, as part of that making Latitude 32 work, I think it needs a coordination between government and some of the major players to really kick it along.
Yeah, so it's that, it's that issue that we've got with National Rail.
Yes.
Bit of coordination. So I've got a question here, and thanks, David. David, not picking up on the state, but I think it's a good question. What are you seeing from infrastructure contributions being levied and the value of uplift as a result of rezoning in the urban releases?
So there's been most of the state governments looking to bring in Victoria, it's called windfall gains tax. So it's a pretty aggressive, and I won't go into the detail of it, but the concept behind it is if state government comes along to you, Mark, and you've got this little farm out in the southeast, and they come along and say, great news, Mark, we're making your land
Here's
industrial,
a 30-year tax.
Then the gain in value gets paid, or a portion, 50% of the gain in value, and there's different time parameters and a whole lot of other parameters that apply, but the part of that uplift goes straight back to government revenue. So that's completely different to development contributions and a whole lot of other government taxes that sit in there.
And I suppose one of the great problems we've spoken about today is the lack of ability to get DCP or GAIC to have a meaningful impact on infrastructure.
Yeah. So that they exist. Their coordination is the challenge. So
it's a bit of the Kerry Packer thing, isn't it? If you give them more money, they may not
use it for the right thing. And to be honest, that's been a very big topic with regards to GAIC. So GAIC, I'll get this wrong, the growth areas infrastructure contribution, I'm hoping I got that right,
Yep, I'll pay that.
was all about getting money from developers to support broader infrastructure. But it was never targeted. So when you go to a DCP, a development contribution plan, it says, well, we're going to build this road, we're going to upgrade this road, we're going to build this set of lights, we build up all those costs, therefore you've got to pay, $100 a metre or whatever it might be. The gate was just, we know we've got to grow, so we're going to get that off you because you're in a growth area. But there was never a direct line between taking the money and spending it even in the region where it was
community
collected.
benefit. Yeah. Now, another one that's here, there's a fellow by the name of Dennis, and he's just asking, can you elaborate on the Brisbane industrial market and where you believe there is limited supply worthy of investment? So he promises that he won't take you 100% on your word, but where would you be targeting if you're looking at industrial investment in Brisbane?
Yeah, I think if you look at where the activity's been, and if you look at the rate of land take-up that's happened in that, let's call it the southern and Gold Coast corridor, call it, and there's still reasonable land activity or land availability up in the northern markets, but the market's demonstrated where it wants to go.
There's a few heading up to Harvey Bay and Townsville.
A bit further away. But I think clearly the market's demonstrated where it wants to go, and the market wants to be along that southern corridor because of the rate of growth down at Gold Coast, and then also the fact that running out the back of Ipswich is the way I get back to Melbourne and Sydney.
Yep.
So, if I was going to go buy a block down there, it'll be much more expensive and it'll be up north, but I think that's where I'm going to get the growth in the tenant demand.
And there's going to be demand. We'll make this the last question, and look, I apologise, there are some terrific questions. But I'll go to, where was this one? Yeah, it's a question from Phil, and he says, do you expect a yield spread between the core markets of Sydney, Melbourne and Queensland and Perth to change, or will they come closer together? How would you see that?
So as yields move, I'll interpret it out loud. So as yields move, will they move at the same pace or not? I'm going to interpret as the question. So I think there's always been a concentration of capital wanting to go into the Melbourne and Sydney markets. That's always been at a price point advantage to most of the other states.
Yes.
I would argue in the last few years that spread between those two states and Brisbane has really come in. Perth has always been to a slight disadvantage. I don't think that's necessarily going to change because, you talk to some of the major development groups that want to grow big pipelines of built form up the eastern seaboard. The reality is the tyranny of distance for their staff, their construction crews, the differences in cost of construction, I don't think that's going to change much.
The impact of mining is still the major driver in WA, isn't
absolutely, it? Yeah. So I don't think what we're seeing now will change where the spreads have sat for the last 5 years, is my best way of trying to answer that.
Well, hopefully we've done a good job in answering all of your questions, and just looking at our time, we've just clicked over probably about an hour after our couple of little interruptions. So you've learned something about watching online. Hitting that refresh button certainly helped. But if you missed some slides, we'll be sharing those a little bit later. So firstly, thank you to all of you for attending. We're really, really pleased with the numbers of people that we've had attend today. It's a really big thanks to Shane Robb and his team at Urbis. It's a wonderful presentation. You'll be able to go back through these slides in about a week's time because Urbis have graciously agreed to share today's content. And I just think the insights that you're going to get as developers and agents and landholders are just invaluable. A big thanks to Julie Lunt, my EA at Vacancy Property. She does a tremendous amount of work, not only for me and my team, but also for industrial commercial partners. So thank you, Julie. And Steph Potter, who is the marketing click over in WA. And the two ladies pulled all of this together. A tremendous job, and we really do appreciate everything that you do. A thanks to Redback Studios for hosting us. So the guys here have been very, very accommodating. And if you're looking at trying to have a venue, I'd highly recommend it. So on behalf of my partners at Industrial Commercial Partners, we'd like you to think local and have a national team support you. And that's exactly by connecting with us. So we hope to talk to you soon. We hope to discuss today's content, and highly recommend this guy sitting to my left. He knows industrial property. Enjoy your day.
Thank you.